Hello, I'm Brandon Becker here to present about pattern interrupts in social engineering. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to use the camera that I have wanted to use, so I'm recording this on a potato. Hopefully, that is not too problematic. Okay, so the first thing is what are pattern interrupts? Basically, let's talk about social patterns first so we can understand what interrupting them is all about. So there's all kinds of social patterns that we have as a society. All behaviors, all human behaviors could generally be broken down into obtaining a reward or escaping some kind of cost or consequence. So you're hungry, you make a sandwich. You're either, you could view that as obtaining sandwich or escaping the feeling of hunger. So when we talk about social patterns, things like a handshake, which we'll come back to that a few different times throughout this, a handshake, it has some sort of social function. I mean, the original function was to show that you're not carrying a weapon and indicate that you have, you have friendly intentions when you greet someone. That's all, that original context has fallen away. Most people probably don't think about that at all. It's just a scripted behavior. You meet someone on friendly terms, you shake their hand. And you don't think about all the individual parts of it. You just do it. You shake hands. It happens very automatically. Generally, social patterns are learned the way most things are learned, modeling and instruction. So you see someone do it and then you imitate that, or someone specifically taught you, here's how you shake hands. And then that's how you learn all those patterns. But it could cover things like customs, rules, laws, just patterned behavior. Sometimes there are cultural patterns that are specific to a particular job or a particular location or a particular culture in the traditional sense, an ethnic or religious culture, and those are patterns. When you violate a social pattern of some kind, there's always going to be a cost of that, of some sense. So for example, if someone came up to you to greet you in a business setting and they offered you their hand to shake it and you just didn't, there would be a consequence for that. It would be extremely awkward. They might think strange of you or be offended or something of that nature. So that's what social patterns are. And they are a type of what's called autonomous multiprocessing, which basically means it happens automatically. You don't think about it. And it's multiple different things going on at once, and they're sort of done together. So it's not quite multitasking where you're doing lots of different parallel things. It's a sequence of things that happen all together as a whole. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is dissociation. And in this case, we're not talking about necessarily a symptom of trauma. Some of you might think of that when you hear the word dissociation. In this case, we're just talking about the very basic concept of a process that should happen unified but can become separated. Okay, so dissociation is something that's normally together and is separated. And when we talk about that in a cognitive sense, a brain sense, it happens all the time. It can happen if someone's distracted from a task that they would normally attend to. It can happen if you've ever accidentally felt your own hair or your own coat brushing you and it startles you for a second. It's your own movement. You should be aware of that, but somehow part of it was outside of your awareness for a moment. Those are all dissociative experiences. Driving trance, where you're on the highway and you get to your destination, but you don't quite remember the last 5 or 10 minutes. You weren't asleep. You were dissociating part of that experience. It just wasn't connected. So that's something to keep in mind because that's going to be part of the future explanation. And also keep in mind that learning always involves abstraction. So essentially, this quote from Guttag is pretty helpful here. The essence of abstraction is preserving information that is relevant and forgetting information that is irrelevant in a given context. So, for example, if someone tells you a whole story of what their problem is at work or what a bad day they had, you don't archive that whole story, every single detail in your memory. You take the most salient points and you say, okay, they got in a car accident, that's why they're late and they're quite upset about it. Okay. You don't log all of the details of the whole story. And this is important when we talk about social patterns, because if someone went to shake your hand and you had to stop and say, okay, wait, they're offering their hand. I need to reach my hand out. I need to meet their hand. I need to grasp it gently up, gently down, gently up, gently down. Wait, is it 2 times or 3 times? You can't do all that. Maybe as a child, when you're first learning the patterns, the social patterns, you do that. Or if you're in a new culture, or if you're in a new business culture, it might take you those first few times of learning each step individually, but it becomes scripted, and then you just do it automatically. A non-social example of this would be, hopefully, when someone is turning when they're driving, they automatically turn their turn signal on. It's just a part of that. And then they start to turn the wheel and they adjust their speed and they're checking for people around them in the various lanes. That should all happen automatically. When you're first learning to drive, you have to pause and think about doing all of those things individually, but it becomes scripted. Okay. So what happens when a pattern gets interrupted? The reason I'm using the handshake example is because, well, for one, it's a very common social pattern that many people are accustomed to, but also because there was this famous psychiatrist, Milton H. Erickson. He's the father of what's known as Ericksonian hypnosis. And he had famously a hypnotic handshake. He was known to give a handshake to people that was sort of awkward and confusing, and it would put them in this light state of trance where they were very suggestible. It didn't necessarily make them like him immediately, because they were like, what is going on here? This is a weird handshake with this kind of meaning. But he used that moment of weirdness to accomplish the therapeutic goals that he had, or that they had together. So the standard handshake script is like this. There's initial visual or verbal contact. You say hi, you see the person, extend the hand, meet the hand, shake up and down, and then you release. And that's it. That's what it should be. Well, Milton Erickson, he wouldn't do that. It would be, he would take their hand and then he would sort of start to gently, almost as if, was it intentional or was it absent-minded, rub part of their hand. And he would have a loose, kind of slowly letting go grip, and he would hold it there. He would maybe shake once and then just sort of hold it there. And he wasn't firm. He wasn't gripping their hand, let me dominate you. It was just sort of, I'm holding on to your hand for a moment. And while he was doing that, he would continue to keep eye contact and talk to the people. And something would happen. Something would be strange when he was doing that, and people would question, what is going on here? What was happening? Well, I'm going to give you an example of what that's like. So take a look at these images, and for a moment, try to understand, what are the objects in these images? Hopefully by now you're starting to realize there aren't actually any objects in these images. These were images created by deep dreaming software, where they're completely simulated. They're parts of images kind of pieced together, but nothing actually, if you look at anything very closely, you can realize that that's not an actual real object. These are not photographs of real things. But your brain had a moment there where you were confused and you were trying to figure out, what the heck am I looking at? And your brain got confused, and maybe you quickly came to the conclusion of, this is not a real photo. Or maybe when I told you, then you felt relief and went, oh, okay, it's not a real photo. That's why I couldn't place what these things were. Some of you might even have determined that some of those objects were particular things. One of the examples I've run into is, sometimes people say, there's, on the right side of the screen, there's definitely a ski mask there. On the left side of the screen, or there's definitely earrings hanging on a case. That there aren't. Those are not, none of these objects are real. But you might have convinced yourself for a moment that you were really seeing those things. And why does that happen? It's because of what's called a trans-derivational search. And some of you computer folks out there might be familiar with that term already. Or if there are any cognitive scientists watching, you might be familiar with that term as well, because the term appears both in computer science and in cognitive science. And basically, a trans-derivational search or a TDS, is your brain or a computer saying, what is the meaning of this? I must search all of my memory to find a meaning for what's happening here. And usually our brains are pretty good at that. They can find an answer for what is happening. You hear a strange sound and your brain will quickly say, oh, that was a dog growling. Okay. Or you hear a strange sound and say, oh, I'm not sure what that was, but it sounds like movement off in the woods while I'm walking at night or I'm camping. Let me at least be cautious and sort of concerned about what that sound might be. And your brain is pretty good at making these judgments. And that's how we've survived for as long as we have. But when it can't immediately or very quickly decide what is the meaning of something, this information that I'm taking in, it gets confused. It has that emotional and psychological state of confusion. So there's some examples of this. Gibberish. When we talk gibberish to babies, it's part of speech learning. Now you wouldn't only ever talk gibberish in baby talk to babies, but that's the first things that you do. When you are listening to other people, speak baby talk and gibberish, you can't quite make out what they're saying because it's not real words. The same way when you hear language that you don't know, another language, you can kind of tell that is language. I'm pretty sure people are communicating in this intentional, structured way, but I have no idea what they are saying. And it can be very frustrating if you've ever been in a situation where someone is trying to communicate with you and you don't share a language. It's very frustrating very quickly for both of you usually. And this is part of why, is because you're searching for meaning, you're trying to understand and you just can't. But sometimes this comes up even within the same language that we have. So I have some examples here of, you did it again. If you've ever been in a friendship or a relationship or a working relationship and someone says to you, you did it again. That's very vague. And you quickly have to ascertain, well, what did I do again? Oh gosh, did I leave the cap off the toothpaste? Did I not turn that report in on time? What is it that I did again? And you might be able to, from a history or from context clues, reach a conclusion. But that sense of not knowing for sure can be very frustrating. Okay, so the idea behind this is when we cause a trans-derivational search on purpose by interrupting a social pattern, the person who's having that pattern interrupted has to wonder why it's happening. Now, if you're doing it on purpose, you know why it's happening. You're trying to confuse the person. Milton H. Erickson, with his hypnotic handshake, was trying to induce a confused state. But the other person, unless they're already somehow aware that's what you're doing, they're just going to wonder, what is the purpose of you shaking my hand strangely, or whatever other pattern you might be interrupting. And that's the basis behind what we're doing here. So this is kind of a long quote from a research paper, but understand that essentially what all of this means is when a human brain is confused, it requires much more cognitive effort or much more resources being used up by the brain than any other state of the mind, because the mind is trying to figure out what it should do and it cannot. So it's lighting up all over the place, just trying to figure out, what am I supposed to be lighting up? What am I supposed to be doing with this information? And the brain doesn't like doing that. I mean, the human body in general wants to reach a state of equilibrium or homeostasis or rest. It doesn't like to be unnecessarily activated. So as soon as the confused state begins, the human brain starts saying, how do I end this? I really don't want to be confused because it's using a lot of resources. So we can use this. We can use this to our advantage. And here's some questions that we want to ask ourselves if we're going to use this to our advantage in a social engineering sense. We're going to have to be a little weird or a little awkward, okay? But we don't want to be so weird that we're off-putting, and we don't want to be so awkward that we're noticeably out of place. So there's a bit of a balance there. So the question is, what's normal for the setting? What gets me closest to my goal, and what arouses the least suspicion? And there's sort of like a Venn diagram you could do there, and that midsection, that's where we want to be. So there are some classic examples of cons that use this and social engineering attacks that use this. And I'll give some of those examples, but you can custom tailor this to situations that you're coming into in social engineering. And I think the most useful approach for it is as a way out, or as a way to misdirect or redirect someone. So you might have heard of what's called a quick change artist, or a short change artist. And that's the idea of someone coming to a cashier and paying in cash for a small item with a large bill. And then as the cashier is counting out the change, the quick change artist says, well, wait, hold on, actually, can I get, and they ask for different change. Well, they already have some of the money in hand and some of the money is in the cashier's hand, and they exchange it. There are videos of this all over the internet. I didn't include one just for copyright reasons, but you can, after this, go Google or YouTube quick change artist, short change artist, and you can see videos of this. It relies on people not being good at math. And so as soon as they're asked to recount smaller denominations of bills to give different change, that's very confusing for them. And they sort of, what the quick change artist is trying to do is induce a state of confusion. And then they say, well, just give me those 220s or those 250s or whatever the case is, and then we should be even. And the cashier very often goes, oh yeah, okay. And they do that, and then they close the drawer, and the person says, okay, thanks, and walks away, and they're gone. And they've gotten, 50 or 100 or whatever dollars back than they really should have from that exchange. Another example is rock, paper, scissors. A mentalist effect, or a magician that does mental illusions, common effect is to use rock, paper, scissors to consistently win over and over and over and over again. And one of the tricks that mentalists use to do that is a pattern interrupt. So the first thing I'll say is you have to know the country you're in, because different countries, or even different parts of the country, they say this differently. Now, where I'm from, we say rock, paper, scissors. Other places say scissors, paper, rock. Okay, wherever you're from, you need to know how you're going to be saying it. Suppose you were to say rock, paper, scissors. That's how people talk when they play rock, paper, scissors where you're at. What you can do later today to test this out is go to say, hey, I want to try something out. I learned about something earlier. Can we play rock, paper, scissors real quick? And they'll say, sure, And you go, okay, rock, paper, what time is it? Or something of that. If they have a watch, you want to ask them, or all of a sudden point something out and they, oh, look at that deer, just distraction of some kind. And they're going to go, what the heck are you doing? Why are you interrupting like that? And then you go, oh, sorry, yeah, we'll play. Okay. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. And then you should, if the one that you stopped them before, if the last one in that sequence is scissors, they should throw scissors, so you should throw rock. And the reason for this is you've interrupted a pattern. Their brain is used to going rock, paper, you call it out loud, rock, paper, scissors, shoot. But if they didn't get to say scissors, their brain is going to be going, ooh, I didn't complete that pattern. So you're interrupting it before the last one. And then that is the one that they'll very likely throw when you let them complete that pattern then. And so you're going to throw the opposite of that. Try it out later. It's a very common, like I said, mentalist effect. It's a silly little thing you can do. You can only kind of do it once per victim, so to speak, but that's another example of how that would work. There are social engineers who talk about the dropped item as a useful social engineering tool. And this is an example of the confusion effect, or the pattern interrupt in that case. So here's what you would do. If someone is coming over to ask you about, are you supposed to be here? Can I see your badge? You're authorized to be in this area, those kinds of questions. And you want to try and redirect from that. You're already in pretty deep. It's a bad situation. So you need to redirect that quickly. This is where, as someone is approaching you and you think that they look like they mean business and they kind of they're going to ask you some tough questions before they get to asking you questions. You might go to shake their hand very happily and eagerly, as you know to do, play it cool. Hey, how you doing? And as you go to do that, drop something, make it awkward. Not as if you're nervous, but just, people are clumsy. And then, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And make a big deal out of cleaning your stuff up. And as you're doing that, you take charge of the conversation and you start asking them questions, somehow to redirect them. Because if you go to shake the hand and you interrupt that by dropping something and then you initiate your questions, their brain is going to be caught in the middle of a pattern, and you have a very brief window. It is seconds at most. It may be milliseconds. You have a very brief window of confusion where they will take any out to stop being confused. And if that's, you start asking them questions that they can answer. Where's the bathroom? How do I get to conference room B? Do you know if Jim is in today? Those kinds of things. They can start answering that. And then their mind is going to be on that track instead of the track that they were on. Now, there are some people who are very determined. They don't care what you're saying you're doing. They're going to come ask you, are you allowed to be here? Where's your badge? And that's a certain type of individual that's going to do that. But many people, if they were going to come and you go to initiate that handshake and then you interrupt it, this confusion technique will help you reroute their brain because of the trans-derivational search. There are all kinds of ways you can use pattern interrupts. It could be any social pattern that you can break. So from the blue team side of things, how could you tell if you're being worked? How could you tell if someone is trying to use a confusion technique or a pattern interrupt on you? So you want to look at some questions from your blue team side, which is, what is the person's intention and how do we know what their intention is? Are boundaries being tested or pushed or crossed? So for example, if you made it very clear that you want them to stay over there and they keep coming closer, that's a physical boundary. If they come into a restricted area and just start talking to you, that's a boundary being crossed. If they start asking you about, personal or unusual questions, that's a boundary being crossed. And look for things such as misdirection, evasion, and justification. If the justification comes about more often when someone's actually a bad actor as opposed to pen testing or something like that. But misdirection and evasion, those are things you're going to look for. And you're always trained to look for those things, but look for them in a pattern interrupt context. If you're seeing people breaking social patterns at awkward moments, that's something that you want to question. Let the answer for your own confusion be, this person could be working me. And what I would like you to also pay attention to is operating outside of someone's normal awareness. So you might be aware that people tend to be very cued into visual or auditory or kinesthetic awarenesses. So some people are more visual, more auditory, etc. And if someone is very acutely tuned into visual things, you would try to operate outside of that pattern, because if you interrupt their field of vision, their visual experience, they will notice that that is weird more quickly. So someone is very kinesthetic and you do a handshake interrupt, they're going to notice that that's weird and be off-put by that more readily than someone who's more visual or auditory. So just keep those things in mind. If you want to try and quickly ascertain, or if you've done lots of OSINT and you know that someone is like a martial arts expert, okay, I'm not going to do a handshake interrupt on them. They're more kinesthetic. They're going to notice that quickly. So use the information you have to determine what patterns, whether it's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, work outside of their key awareness. So just a few final thoughts on how to use this pattern interrupt in a social engineering sense. Basically, anytime you're trying to get out or get to some information very quickly, and you think that a bit of confusion can throw someone off in a way that's not going to draw too much attention to you. So again, basic steps are try and figure out what social pattern you can interrupt, ask a question or give a direction to rescue them from that confusion, and try to operate outside of their key awarenesses. So if they're very visual, make it kinesthetic or auditory. If they're very auditory, make it visual or kinesthetic. And if they're kinesthetic, make it auditory or visual. I've left time for questions, so if you have any, you can ask them after this.